Dr. Juan Carlos Fernandez Diaz is the research assistant professor at the University of Houston, and he's a co-investigator with the National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping. We'll send you a couple videos and links to the National Center's information afterwards or after this, so no worries there. Dr. Timothy Murtha is an associate professor at the Center for Latin American Studies and a founding faculty member of FIBER. He'll explain that in a second. Again, Tim works with drones and drone mapping, has a couple of awesome fly-throughs for us today. Last but not least, I am honored to have Dr. Paul Larocque of Teledyne Optech on the call. Paul is the senior scientist at Teledyne Optech and has been involved with all manner of just incredible stuff over the years. Please, if you have any questions, you'd be hard pressed to find a deeper well of knowledge in regards to LIDAR. So please submit questions during the webinar and we'll address them at close. So without further ado, Juan, I'm going to hand things over to you if you'd like to get rolling and tell folks what's going on your end.
Thank you, Alan. Let's see, I'll wait for, I have control.
You do?
So I have control. So I like this equation. We have been doing this for the last 10 years. We have mapped almost over 10,000 square kilometers, and we have hundreds of really cool discoveries. Of course, the 25 minutes or 30 minutes that I might talk won't be able to cover the hundreds, but I'll try to give you like a brief overview of some of the key aspects that we have done. So I don't know how many of you remember the first time that you heard the word LIDAR. I remember it perfectly. It was back in 1997, and I was undergrad on a field trip at the NASA Wallops Flight Facility in Virginia. And I remember they had their P3 Orion with a LIDAR system. And that was the first time that I came across not only the name, but also the technology. I wish I had taken a picture of me with the LiDAR, but I did not. I was more interested at that time in actually taking a picture with the Huey that you see there. But at that point, I did not imagine that, 10 years later, I will be studying like LiDAR technologies at the University of Houston, University of Florida as a graduate student, and much less I will imagine that 15 years later, in 2012, I will be like, sitting inside an airplane, flying over the Mosquito of Honduras and actually doing like, what was one of the most interesting projects that I have ever done. And about 20 years later, I was able to fly in a Huey over the jungles of Honduras. But the interesting thing in all of that is like I never imagined that I was going to be in what some people call a geospatial revolution with regards of the use of LiDAR for archaeology investigations, particularly in this area that we call Mesoamerica, and it encompasses parts of Mexico and parts of Central America. And the revolution, it's not only in terms of science or technology, it's also a revolution because we see the mass media going crazy about this thing. Every time that we do a project, I think, wow, this will be the last time that the media will be interested in this and it's gonna become old news, but no, you can see it. Like in this screen, I have New York Times stories that range from 2010 all the way to last week. And like, it seems that the story never gets old, which, I mean, I'm glad that I'm wrong. So let me talk a little bit of our research center and why we have been involved with this. The National Center for Airborne Laser Mapping, it's funded by the National Science Foundation, and we are based at the University of Houston, and also we have a small component at the University of California, Berkeley. But we have three main goals. Goal number one is to train and educate students such as me that go from like, knowing nothing to be able to lead large-scale survey projects using LiDAR and other geospatial technologies. We also have a goal of actually push for the advancement of the state-of-the-art in LiDAR and other remote sensing technologies. And third, but not least, and that's how we actually get involved with all these cool projects, is that we aim to provide like research quality airborne LiDAR data to the scientific community. In terms of advancement of pushing the envelope on the technology, we got started in 1996, mapping like a portion of the Florida coast in the Panhandle, and like we did not have a sensor, we did not have an airplane, but like through contacts that was done, and I have here an image that it's like more than 20 years old, and what's really interesting and what I like of this image is that we can see how technology advanced. Back then, like, you had to say, oh, these are trucks, these are cars, this is a building, right? Like nowadays we see these images and like we really understand what's going on. Oops, I think I lost control. Oh, there it's back. Okay, so this line actually shows like what has been our like development in terms of technology deployment in LiDAR based on optic technology since 1999 all the way to present day. Paul will talk a little bit later, and like we have been we have been partners in the development of some of these key instrumentations. For example, we were the first customer for a Gemini, and we were the first customer for the Titan multispectral multi-channel system. And interesting things, those that are familiar with LiDAR technology, you will think like the most important change that we see here is like a higher PRFs. But the reality of things is that there's many other advances in the technology that actually affect the way that the quality of the data that is collected. And I'm going to show you one example of how technology has evolved and how technology can propel, technological evolution can propel new applications. So in the context of providing data for research purposes, we have conducted over 33 different projects in Mesoamerica, ranging from central Mexico and in Michoacan, all the way to the Mosquitia in the eastern part of Honduras, and we have mapped over 12,000 square kilometers to date. Each one of these projects has its own cool things that I wish I had time to show them all, but like I just picked like a few key findings from projects. And while some of these projects make it to the media, I think like every project, it's worth it of media attention, although some don't get it. So why is LiDAR important for archaeological investigations? I have an illustration here. I like to say that there's a Maya city that everybody knows, and it's because we have seen that Maya city in a very popular movie. And in episode 4, right, like we have the Millennium Falcon approaching this lost city in the jungles of Guatemala known as Tikal. So everybody has seen Tikal at least once. So if we approaching the Millennium Falcon from 30,000 feet, this will be what we see. It's just like a lot of forest. Sometimes we see some structures that poke out of the vegetation, right? But obviously, as Alan was mentioning, the real importance is like, oops, well, there was a change in the slides there. But once we remove the vegetation, we see like an amazing city hidden by the vegetation. And this is what really allows us to actually understand a lot of what's going on in the forest in Central America. So, but some archaeologists say that it's not really what you find, it's actually what you find out. And in terms of that, I have 4 different kinds of points that I want to try to illustrate with some examples of data and projects that we have made over the years. So one of the first things is that one of the first advantages of LiDAR, it allows us to map not only the site, like on this screen to the left, you have like the traditional way that archaeologists using GPS or total stations would map a site through vegetation or out in the open. And you have like that kind of prismatic models of archaeological structures. To the right, you see the same kind of display, but over LIDAR data. And what you see is like not only do you have the structures, but you have the context of the landscape. Another interesting thing is that, like happens always, is that you see that what sometimes people miss structures on the ground that you don't miss from the air, and those are the things that we have like with highlighted with these yellow arrows. But to illustrate further, I want to show data from this project, which was the first archaeological project that we conducted in 2009. I want to say, like, you know, in Europe, archaeologists have been using LIDAR since the 2000, but the archaeological and ecological context in Europe are very different than the jungles of Central America. So it took like, you know, 9 more years for it to actually catch up in Central America. So this was 2009, using like the Gemini sensor, what I call like a second generation sensor. We mapped approximately 200 square kilometers with about 24 hours of flying. And this is a sample. This is what you'll see from 30,000 feet. Like, you know, it will be just the vegetation, but when you remove the vegetation, you see much more stuff. Not only you see like the big buildings, right here, but you pointed with these yellow arrows, we see causeways, like ancient roads that connect these sites to other sites. And more impressive, all through the landscape, and highlighted with this blue arrow, what we see, it's actual modification of the terrain into terraces for agricultural purposes and land water management purposes. A better figure is perhaps this one. In this figure, you actually get to see again the causeways or the roads between the site of Caracol and other sites. But more impressively, you see all the landscape that was modified in terms of terraces. So that's one of the things, being able to see the site in the context of the landscape. Now the things that are like typical Indiana Jones, like actually finding the lost sites, which are not lost. It's just like, let's call them uncharted, right? So not only do we are able to find like sites that we did not know anything about, or modern science did not know about, but also the sites that we know and we usually map tend to be larger and more complex than what originally were thought to be. An example of a project where we actually was a complete flight of discovery was here in the Mosquita region of Honduras. And we mapped 3 different areas, about 140 square kilometers. This was the third archaeological project that we conducted in the region. But if we focused in one of those areas, in the target number 1, in a 60 square kilometer valley, we found about 19 different uncharted sites. And we had the opportunity to visit one of them like in 2015. And this is actually covered in National Geographic and other media. But right here in this site, you can see like these structures that look like they are mounds, these mounds that are arranged like in rectangular patterns and stuff like that. Right here in this area, we came across like a cache of 50 something stone artifacts that were like, you know, obviously some sort of offering. And I was there when these things were found, and like, you know, I have to tell you, it felt like, you know, they were left there like, you know, last year or something like that. But it had been like, you know, at least 500 years since they were left. This project, like, you know, and this project has been covered in multiple media sources, from National Geographic to documentaries to movies. And there's a book, The Lost City of the Monkey God, that tells all the story about this project. And like, you know, I think it's one of the books where LIDAR plays like a central role. But back to other sites, like this is a project that we conducted in 2017. Right here in the center, it's the main site that the archaeologists knew about. And this kind of yellow rectangle was the intended coverage area. And it happens more often than what you imagine, like in the edge of the coverage area. Once you see, there's other sites or a larger site. In this case, like, it's a large site with very large platforms. And sometimes I have here that the site, it's usually the landscape, or the landscape is the site. This is a platform where when the archaeologists used to walk over it, what they saw, it's like, flat terrain, and they thought it's a natural formation. But once you have the bird's eye view without the canopy, you can see like there's definitely human modification of the area. So this is an example again of how sites are larger or more complex than what originally thought. Another example, going back to the city of Tikal, this is Tikal, and about 5 kilometers from the center of the city, we have this structure that comes along, and I have it highlighted with red and black arrows. So this is not a road, this is actually a ditch and rampart system, or like, in other words, a wall. So this wall was built for protection. And the funny thing is that when the archaeologists were working with this project and defining the area which they thought they wanted covered, they thought, okay, in this area, we think we have covered the entire city. And like, based on the wall, we have about 10 kilometers of wall. And like, there's much more that we did not cover. At least on the first survey. More of these will come in the next years, because just this year we went to Guatemala and we collected much more data around here. So the other important thing is like the distribution of settlements. It's more widespread than we originally, or archaeologists originally imagined, even into areas where perhaps are not like suitable for habitation. An example of this comes from this project, like the largest scale project that we have ever conducted in 2016. We collected about 2,000 square kilometers spread over an area that covers about 16,000 square kilometers. Funny thing here is that we had a third generation sensor. We had the Titan multispectral multi-channel system. So for those of you that don't know, it has like it's like having 3 LIDARs in a single sensor. Here, if you remember Caracol, we collected about 200 square kilometers, and it took 20 flight hours. Here, with about twice the flight hours, we collected 10 times the area. So that's one of the advantages of new technologies. But going back to archaeology, right? So we map like these 10 distinct areas. And in each of them, archaeologists went into the LIDAR data and put like, for every structure that they saw, they put like a single dot on ArcGIS, right? So what we have here is just like what they knew based on ground survey between 2000 and 2015 in one of these areas. All of these white dots represent like archaeological structures. After the LIDAR in 2016, and after a lot of many hours of ArcGIS analysis, all of these black dots represent structures. So you can see the difference in not only the number of known sites, but the density of the settlement is much more larger and wider. And if we do the same thing over the entire area, they're able to derive these urban settlement maps, or urban density maps. And you have different classes from rural all the way to urban. And you can see how the distributions of population happens within the landscape. Of course, what we have here are just like little boxes, but you can pretty much extrapolate from the information that we have here into all the other landscape. And with that, they were able to estimate that within this area, in this dotted area, the population was about, well, I forgot right now, but I think it was about 11 million inhabitants within couple hundred years time period, which is much larger than it's intended. So finally, I want to show that there's abundant evidence of large-scale human modification of terrain for water management, agriculture, defense features, and to a certain degree transportation, indicating how adept we humans are at actually changing our environment. So for that, I'll show this image from Tintal that it's also from the Pacunan project in Petén, Guatemala. This area is about 85 square kilometers, but within this small area, we have like, 3 different examples of very massive infrastructure investments. This thing that you see over here, that's a causeway that it's like half a marathon long. It goes from this side of Tintal all the way to a larger site of Mirador to the northeast. This thing that you see here, barely see it perhaps, it's a water canal that can take water both from this kind of lagoon area, actually it's a flat area, back into the river, or from the river vice versa. That's a 2.4 kilometer canal. And right here in the perimeter of the city, you have a half a kilometer long canal that it's multi-purpose. This is a different representation of the LIDAR data. But what we have here is kind of a moat or a canal. This is an artist's representation showing how water could have been used, how this canal could have been used both to store water and as a defensive feature. And if you think like those half a marathon long causeway, it's impressive. Here I have a sample from the largest causeway that it's known in the Maya world. And it goes from a site called Yaxuna, south of Chichen Itza in Yucatan, all the way to the east to a site of Cobá. This causeway, it's about 100 kilometers long. And it's about the equivalence of a 3-lane highway. So I always tell people, if you think of our roads right here in Houston, right, like they don't last long before we have potholes, and you have like this 100-kilometer long causeway that has withstand like the pass of time, probably better than our modern highways. Moving along. Water features, water control features. We see these all through the landscape. They were modifying the landscape to create reservoirs, to store and control the flow of water. This is like in central Mexico. Here to the left, this is in each one of these dots. It's actual a water reservoir around the Caracol in Belize. So we have these kind of features that are like large reservoirs, open reservoirs in the landscape, but I'd like to show this one. And this is in the Puc region of Mexico, in Campeche, in the state of Campeche. And all of those dots that you see that looks like holes are entrances to underground reservoirs. And I find it really impressive. Like these entrances, you can see are a couple of feet wide, and you can clearly see it on the high density LIDAR data. Finally, important is the investment that went into protecting some of these sites. We have like walls, just like you would imagine, like a medieval castle up on the top of the hill with fortifications all along the hill. So these are examples. One is in Guatemala and one in Belize, and you can see the amount of effort that went into developing these defensive features. But let's talk now about important things. We talk about water. Let's talk about food. In the 2016 LIDAR data from Guatemala, archaeologists started seeing like these kind of features, linear features on really low, flat, and usually inundated areas. And these features, although these have not been field verified, most of them are actually canals used for irrigation of agricultural fields. So it's really cool that through LIDAR we are able to see these features. Now, in the same year, in 2016, and this is really hot off the press, this came out of the press like about a week or two ago, in a different part of Belize, we find more evidence of lowlands modification of terrain for agricultural features. All of these things that you see here are fields that were canals and fields. You dug the canal to control the flow of water, and you raised the fields to actually grow crops over the water level. So this is an interesting advancement, but I want to show perhaps what with an interesting thing, and it has to do with how technology has advanced. So this is the same area in Belize that from the previous slide. And if you focused on this area around here on the shaded relief DM image, you don't see the evidence of canals and fields. But if you look at the multispectral intensity image, you can start making up the same patterns of grids, fields, and canals.
Hey, Juan, you may have muted yourself there briefly. Are you still there? Hey, Juan, I think we're going to jump over to Tim now. I know you're close there at the end, but I'm going to transition over to Tim. I think we might have just there briefly at the end might have lost your audio. Tim, are you connected and ready to go?
I'm connected, ready to go, and it's really a perfect opportunity to kind of kick over and start taking a look at the other part of the story coming from an archaeological perspective.
It is. You're good to go. Thanks, Tim. Sorry about that, Juan, but Tim can get, like he said, perfect. He was right about to transition anyway. So here you go, Tim.
So what I'd like to talk about, I mean, the transformative work that NCALM has done has radically changed the way that archaeologists think about the questions we ask and the way we answer those questions. And for me, it's really humbling because a lot of the places that I worked in the 90s and before Juan was able to fly the plane over places like Tikal and Caracol, I was dragging a total station through the tropical forest, mapping terraces, the very same terraces at Caracol, and mapping the earthwork at Tikal in 2004, doing all of this using what we would now consider low-scale technology, but it was a means to get this bigger picture of the ancient Maya and the past. And so the work that they've done has been incredible, but it's also emphasized the way we work is changing, and we work with big teams. So I may be talking to you today, but a lot of the work that I will talk to you about has been influenced by a great number of people, especially here at the University of Florida, GatorEye, Angelica Almeida Zambrano, and Evan Broadbent, who have we've worked together to build GatorEye into something that can be a precision tool. Charles Golden, Andrew Scherer at Brandeis and Brown University, Shanti Morrell-Hart. And part of the reason is we are using these tools to try to identify and understand processes and stories, and especially about questions of sustainability and resilience. We recently published an article about using our drone-mounted LIDAR survey in the Maya lowlands to talk about some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that are offered in relationship to the survey that Juan has been talking about. And we also thankfully have just recently initiated an NSF project in partnership with Juan, who acquired data on the very same day we were out in the field using the drone. So if you're interested, I can share that article with you. But I wanted to talk more about the narrative of place and how we as archaeologists view all these data and all these maps. And I like this quote from Pierce Lewis, who's a cultural geographer at Penn State University, in part because I think what LIDAR is starting to reveal is that every piece of the planet has been touched by human action. Sometimes it's small decisions, sometimes it's very large decisions. And these bits and pieces, these pages of the book are brought together and edited and re-edited through time. And our job as archaeologists is partly to document in such a beautiful way as Juan and the lab has, but it's also to understand what use of that is that today and how we can derive our stories and understand them. And in the lowland Maya area, the place that I'll talk about, this idea about sustainability, resilience, and getting to know the past has been tightly linked to aerial photos and remote sensing for decades. So beginning in the 1960s and the 1970s, people started scouring aerial photos, and partly it was really coupled to questions about agrarian development for the Maya. So did the Maya collapse? Where did the Maya go? How did the Maya feed themselves? And it was places like the Rio Candelaria in Campeche, some of which you saw in the LIDAR images, was first just images using black and white aerial photos. Perhaps one of the most important ones was in 1974, a science article by Billy Lee Turner, and he radically transformed the way we thought about Maya land use and the densities of population, because he found terracing in an area that we didn't think that the Maya had expanded their agrarian intensive activity. And this was reported in Science in 1974. So it's this kind of integrated approach to look at landscape as a whole, and not necessarily where the Maya lived, but how each part of the landscape has responded to the different densities of Maya, the urban centers, the non-urban centers, the coast and the water. And in reality, a lot of this derived from remote sensing, our fascination trying to get this big picture. And nobody's been more impactful in that area than Tom Seaver at NASA. He was one of the first people to look at, archaeologists, we need to look at multiple sensors, multiple approaches. So what I'd like to talk to you about today is the way we're trying to use multiple sensors, multiple approaches, LIDAR in addition to other sensors and other technologies, just to try to get a bigger picture of the lowland Maya landscape. Two sites, how I got involved in this, have already been introduced a little bit. One is Tikal and one is Caracol. In the 90s, when I was working on my dissertation, I had the privilege of working at Caracol with Arlen and Diane Chase, who were the very first to get the LIDAR flights. But before LIDAR, Caracol was a very inaccessible place, 4 hours away from civilization. We used to live in the jungle for 4 months, and I would carry a total station on my back to make AutoCAD maps of ancient Maya households and terraces. And the terrace systems are fascinating. They're these stone constructed systems around every household with reservoirs for water, a very sustainable and resilient system where people lived for hundreds of years, despite the changes in climate, despite the changes in precipitation, we're able to manage and maintain this beautiful landscape. Well, turn to 2009, the LIDAR confirmed the scale and expanse. When you're the only person walking around and looking at these terraces and mapping these terraces, people have a hard time understanding scale. It's not until Juan and his team mapped Caracol that people really fully understood the distribution of this resilient and sustainable system. But even just mapping the features isn't enough for us. Part of what we need to do is understand how these features are connected and how they're used through time. And so a lot of what I do is try to couple the remote sensing in these large scale maps to smaller scale samples of soil and excavations. And in this, what was really interesting, we were able to look at one aspect of soil, in this case, total phosphorus, and look at distance away from households to understand that these Maya communities with terraces and households were intensively using landscapes around their houses as gardens. And as they moved away from their garden, the distance away from households, they were using them more like traditional agrarian fields. Coupled to the LIDAR, it gives us a really fine perspective of how many people and how much land could this landscape, or how many people could this landscape support through time. At Tikal, we asked similar questions, but there weren't terraces in the form that we had seen at Caracol. And so without a physical manifestation of what people are doing, it's sometimes hard for an archaeologist to figure out how these places change through time. At the time, here are some great photos of Tikal, some of which you've seen in Star Wars. But at the time, one of the ways in which we did this is before LIDAR was taken of Tikal just a few years ago, we used Iconos and the near infrared. And what that allowed us to do was to document regional areas. And this is showing the, it's a 421 composite band of the Tikal area. And what you see in blue are the lowland areas, and what you see in the white areas are upland and residential density areas. Instead of identifying specific features, it allowed us to actually start to piece together this landscape, how it might have been used and how it might have been lived in. You can see the great earthwork along the northern part that's drawn in black. That was something we mapped again with a total station. We added to the map by adding the feature on the west. Today, we sent those data over to the team at Pakenam so they could rectify what we did in the past and identify more of those features. So it's been really fascinating, but all of this remote sensing only provided us with a currency for understanding the Maya, not necessarily specific features. We always had to develop scientific models to test our ideas. And here, again, we looked at soil and isotopic enrichment to determine where the Maya were actually producing corn or where there was evidence of past maize production. We would sample a 1 square kilometer area and scale that up to something that we called the maize model or the corn model, which was tightly correlated to this image of Tikal's forest. What we were trying to do in this research was to try to couple what we saw in the landscape to what the forest and what we were gathering from remote sensing, because we could not penetrate that canopy. What this shows is simply the different types of sensors and remote sensing products we were trying to use to just scale up our knowledge. With the advent of NCALM and LIDAR, it has really transformed the way we can start to ask questions. We can reduce the number of predictors that we test against, and we can also refine the precision with which we make decisions or interpretations on the landscape. So that leads me to the project that I talk a little bit about today with all of my great partners here at the University of Florida and lots of other places. It started with a single data set, a single LIDAR data set. And one of our research partners, Charles Golden, called me up while I was at Penn State and said, Tim, we should take a look at these data. They may be useful. And what these were LIDAR transects, the G-Light system, that were acquired to refine measurements of above ground carbon storage in lowland Mexico. And this is the above ground carbon storage map, and they were designed to kind of refine measurements as it relates to slope. But what we found was an incredible transect that transected, the whole Maya lowlands, an area that went between sites, large samples, small samples. But if you look, you've got the north coast of the Yucatan all the way to the highlands of Chiapas, and hundreds of samples were acquired. We compared that to what we knew about ancient Maya settlements and sites, and we found that a large majority, a good percentage of these sites, were not within 5 kilometers of what we knew to be archaeological sites. And for our purposes, instead of defining then a LIDAR capture, this was almost like a perfect scientific experiment. What would we see as related to Maya settlements, resilience, and sustainability in areas that we didn't know there were big sites or little sites? How did this correspond or relate to the distribution of soil types all throughout the landscape? As we started to, and this is a soil map showing just the great diversity of ecotypes that you can see across the Maya lowlands. When we started to process these data, they were small transects of 300 meters wide, but similar to the brilliant data that Juan and NCALM have gathered, we saw incredible features on the landscape, households, terraces, water management features. And we are in the process of inventorying all 550 of those samples to get a better understanding. If you looked at each one of these, you might even see a different fingerprint of how the Maya adapted to their landscape, whether they had 400 millimeters of precipitation per year or whether they had 1,500 millimeters of precipitation per year. Each place responded through settlements and through their decision-making about how to use that landscape more effectively. And here again are just some process samples that show the great diversity of Maya responses to their needs. In order to really size up these samples, once we're done annotating, and we just started doing this past year with the support of the National Science Foundation, we've teamed up with GatorEye here at the University of Florida, and we're deploying a UAV-based LIDAR system to expand the coverage of areas where we find different features. As you'll see, I'll show you some photos. Some of these features are so small and so difficult to get a grasp of. When you're looking at that 30,000-foot scale, it may be hard to classify what is a terrace, what is a canal. So we like to try to scale these up in very different ways. And so here's the team. This was 2 years ago, some of the samples we took along with our LIDAR drone powered by butterflies, and anytime we bring it out, it's good fun. Lots of members of the community join us in the field. This is us, and I want to show this for two reasons. One, there's Evan, our pilot, and the scientist behind GatorEye. Evan and Angelica are incredible scientists out of Stanford who have built this drone. We call it Indiana Drones now, by the way. And you can see him pointing up to the sky. He's actually pointing at Juan in their plane. So we have this perfect natural experiment too, where we were flying the drone over a site and NCALM was capturing data. Part of the challenge for us is that the modern landscape, especially in places like Chiapas, isn't densely forested cohesively or in a monolithic fashion. We have different types of land cover that we need to address. And we also have different land uses through time. Some areas are burned, some areas are not. And trying to refine our samples so that we can get a real mature and sophisticated understanding will require uses of terrestrial LIDAR, UAV-based LIDAR, and certainly with the help of the NCALM LIDAR. We are now scaled up to be able to capture 6 square kilometers of data on a single day. That's maxing out all of our batteries. Which is quite an interesting thing, bringing the drone to and from the field. But we can get some pretty high density point clouds and we're getting a lot of great ground returns. So I wanted to show you some of those data. This was some of the initial flights that Charles led with a team from Phoenix LIDAR Systems in Guatemala. This just shows you the density of point clouds. This is before we upgraded the sensor the past year. So we've gone to a VLP 32 this year. And we're able to fly higher and not necessarily worry about losing the drone, but also getting a lot more returns, especially ground points. But similar to the work we did at Tikal, we're not just simply looking for our bare earth ground. We want to couple this to the forested areas so that we can truly understand that dynamic between how the Maya maintained and sustained their civilization through time and how they adapted to the landscape. These are some of the images that are coming from our most recent samples, and this is a place called Benemérito de las Americas, where I just wanted to give you a sample of the density of points that we're capturing, especially as it relates to the different types of land cover. And I think that's where our UAV drone is going to be most effective. Being able to see little features in this image, we could even identify looters pits who are digging holes into some of the architecture, and we were able to quantify just how much earth was removed from here. In section, you can see that, in areas where we don't have substantial land cover, we're getting lots of ground points, but also in areas where we have a transition, a quick transition to secondary growth, we're getting real positive results from this sample. To kind of wrap up the discussion of the Maya, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of these features that Juan has shown. The Maya landscape, I don't think that there's any bit that we would argue has been untouched by humans. And part of our jobs as archaeologists is to try to build a story, a narrative together that looks at these places in process. The fascinating thing for myself, and I think all of my colleagues, is that the more we start to map, the more we start to realize how intensively used this landscape was, but also how sustainable it was. And this is how small these features can be. If you can look in the middle, that's our colleague Andrew, who's standing on top of what is one of these raised fields. He's actually standing in the canal of what we presume to be an ancient raised field system. We still need to do some tests on that, but on the right-hand side, you can kind of see the excavation there, the dark earth. That dark earth used to be heaped on top of the place where you would grow your crops and water would run in your canals. We actually have spent very little time studying that, but we acquired samples this year, and we really think that in areas where we have some cleared landscape, we'll be able to map out these features with great precision using the UAV drone. But beyond the map, the most important thing I think that we can say comes from all of our work is this notion of environmental possibilism that was put forward by Denny Puliston, who was a great archaeologist, worked at Tikal. Matter of fact, he was the first one to talk about the earthwork, the big wall around Tikal. And I'd like to just end on some of the positive narratives that we can learn from the ancient Maya. What we're doing with all of these great technologies is trying to understand their achievements in context. And part of those achievements were adapting to a landscape that sometimes had a lot of rain, sometimes had a little rain. Sometimes there were droughts, sometimes there were not droughts. Sometimes there were wars, and sometimes there was long stretches where regional systems didn't have any conflict. Mapping those stories out and trying to understand them more effectively allows us to think more clearly about questions of sustainability and resilience for the future. So thanks a lot for your time. I look forward to any questions you might have.
Excellent. Thanks, Tim. This is fascinating. I think most of the folks would agree that there's just so many potential implications, so many potential applications, sustainability, how this plays into our attempt to understand, map, manage, today. This is all just great stuff. We've got a bunch of questions and we've got plenty of time. I hope we're reconnected there with Juan and that Dr. Larocque has been able to connect okay. But I'll move on into Q&A here for us. Please submit via the window to the right. Looks like everyone's here. And I'll start with some of the initial questions. Can you speak, or let's at least confirm, Juan, are you connected okay? Still going to try to work to connect Juan. We lost his audio at some point, and there were several questions.
Could I break in here for a second?
Yes, sir. Is that this Dr. Larocque?
Paul Larocque from Teledyne Optech. I just wanted to confirm I'm online, and
yes,
I just want to say it's just thrilling to see these incredible results from LIDAR instruments, and especially even the drone results that are going to be coupled so well with the airborne LIDAR and getting even finer detail on the ground. It's just it's very, very exciting. We're very pleased to have played a part in this. Yeah.
You've worked for some time, Paul, with NCALM. You've been connected since I believe the inception. I mean, since can you speak to some of the work you've done with him, or just a little more?
Sure. I mean, going way back to when it was just in its infancy, the National Center was still in University of Florida, and they saw the potential of very early airborne LIDAR instruments, and so they purchased one of our very early ones back in the late 90s, basically. It was only like a kilohertz rep rate. It could only fly maybe a kilometer high, but they did some very good work with that airborne mapping LIDAR. And then later they were they funded us to develop an underwater system called the Aquarius. That was another significant instrument based on the Gemini terrain mapper. But then this last big generation, of which the data that you've seen comes from, is the Optech Titan, which Juan mentioned is like having 3 LIDARs in one. It's got 3 different wavelengths that come out in 3 different angles, and it just a lot of academic research has been done on that in characterizing land cover and so on. And so, yeah, they were foundational in us developing our LIDAR instruments back to when the very early days of airborne terrain mapping. So we're very pleased to have that collaboration with them.
Fascinating. No, can you speak at all to what you're excited about, or to what's forthcoming, or any challenges on the horizon? I mean, you've got a unique perspective, Paul. I mean, you've been doing this for some time. Can you speak briefly to anything in that regard? What's on the horizon, or?
Well, the key thing that's differentiating about the Titan is it's 3 different wavelengths. And so, of course, looking at any kind of it's not just the range that we can get from the instrument, but the intensity for each laser shot. And its combined repetition rate is 900 kilohertz. For getting, Juan mentioned how much faster the Titan can survey. Well, that's due to that almost a megahertz repetition rate. But by comparing all those intensities from 3 different wavelengths, you can really get a sense of what that material is. And you can, other folks at other universities have done a lot of work in even looking at tree species. So it has a forest inventory applications there too. But one thing about the Titan, I'll have to admit, it is very large and heavy. Seeing it coupled with a drone is like seeing David and Goliath together, because the drone is on the opposite end of the spectrum of LIDAR instruments. And we have been doing work in that area, of course, ourselves, in getting UAV drones out there. But I guess the challenge is for a heavy, large instrument like Titan is the expensive airtime and the cost of a flight time and personnel. And that's where the drones really come in strong. Of course, they can't cover as much area, but as far as the economic use, they're quite something. Yeah.
Can you speak to the resolution of Titan LiDAR? You may have mentioned it earlier, but what's the returns per square meter? Can you speak to that?
Oh, actually, the Optech LiDARs have a programmable swath width or a scan angle. Okay. So we can get down to hundreds of points per square meter simply by narrowing the swath. But even with a wide area mapping scenario, it's many points per square meter.
Sure. Couple of the quick, and any of you guys can chime in on some of these, but they've got several that have come in. How deep in water? We've addressed this before, but how deep in water can LiDAR measure? Speaking to current systems. You guys have kind of a general number?
Sure. So the Optech Titan is what we would call a shallow water mapper because it has a green wavelength at 532 nanometers. But we call it a shallow water mapper because it's probably limited to 15 to 20 meters in clear water. And the key thing is to have very clear water, because once you enter the water medium, the scattering really takes over, the absorption and so on. LiDAR instruments that are specifically designed for underwater mapping, like the older Shoals generation or the SeaSmill system that's done in our U.S. office, it can go down to 70 meters in clear water, and it's demonstrated that. Yeah.
Sure,
that's about the limit.
Yeah.
Of course, the beam spreads dramatically, and getting those photons back from such a depth is a challenge.
Sure.
The other aspect is to have like a reflective bottom. Sometimes the water might be clear, but the bottom it's dark, and so
yes,
you don't have any returns.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That are the two main factors. Yes, having black mud at the bottom, the depth penetration can be very, very shallow.
Indeed. Yeah. Juan, here's one that you guys, maybe you and Tim, we got a couple of questions I wanted to get to regarding just the collects that you guys, had done. The initial question was, when performing LiDAR collects in Mesoamerica, are you using ground control points to validate the point cloud and digital elevation?
Well, certain areas it's possible. Certain other areas, everything is covered by jungle, so it's impossible to get like ground control points. But you validate with the ground control points, say like at the airport or a road nearby.
Yeah, definite obstruction, or I'd say that's the ultimate case of canopy down there. Has the data revealed more road networks, and if so, to what extent? I believe yes. You guys addressed was a 3-lane 100-kilometer highway. It's just fascinating what you guys have what you've seen. Couple more.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and like so yeah, the more, I mean, more road networks will be revealed in like, you know, the coming months or years.
Yeah, this is one I'll try, and I've got a few others, but this just had come through. Will the different land coverage, say the Pacific coast, in contrast with the Maya lowlands, affect the archaeological results of LIDAR?
I mean, I think we can say for sure that we need to figure out, especially when it comes to the drone, we're still working on means to process these data and filter these data. So yeah, I mean, the simple answer is yes, but we're developing throughputs that allow us to look based upon what we know is there and try to identify the best means to process these data. So yeah.
I want to add, like, it's very similar to the bathymetry question, like, you know, how deep can you see? So there's two factors that affect. One is, like, you know, the nature of the cultural features that you are trying to identify. Certain cultural features are bigger than others. So that will be like the equivalence of the reflectance of the bottom. And the other thing, yeah, for sure, is the canopy and the environment for each site. It's very different. So we usually try to test what's the best configuration to try to achieve the best penetration given the environmental conditions, and to obtain like the best ground definition or fidelity based on the cultural features characteristics.
Juan, can you speak to how NCALM chooses where to work, or how the process, where, I mean, you touched on this briefly, but how do you guys decide where you're going to work? It's a funding thing.
Well, actually, it works the other way around. Usually, like, investigators, like team or any other archaeologist will, you know, try to find funding, and then they come to us and say, hey, we have funding for a project in X area. Can you do it? So that's where we go. That's how we do it. The funding has to come from an external source.
Sure, and I believe that's explained on the site, you know, your process. We'll again follow up. A couple of folks had asked about the slide deck. We will upload after the presentation. There was an issue with the videos. The inclusion is distilling the PDF. We'll get all that fixed. You'll have it here within, the link will be working within 30 minutes. So you also receive a follow-up. We always get these questions with a link to the video and the slide deck and several other resources within. We shoot for 24 hours, but within 48, no problem. So couple, or we'd seen this before, and now one, how can someone come to work at NCALM? One, is that something, can you apply, or are you looking for help? How can you get involved?
So usually we're an academic institution. The best way to get, you know, through the door, it's actually come as a as a grad student, and for sure we also have a posting from time to time, very rarely, but they do come.
Can you speak to what's next? What projects is the majority of the work, you know, moving forward, focused in Central South America? Is there anything else, other projects you can speak to that are confirmed, or that you're planning?
Well, you know, like for sure the frontier, the frontier that I see, it's pretty much the Amazon in Colombia, Brazil, Ecuador, Peru. That's culturally very interesting, and like environmentally very important too. So that's one frontier. We're looking into projects also in Southeast Asia, like Cambodia, Vietnam, Laos, stuff like that.
That makes sense. Yeah, I think that there's quite an opportunity or a need there, similar stuff. Anything you guys want to, I mean, I've got more folks. We'll respond directly to any questions that we weren't able to answer. It's no problem. It's a quick email. So, you know, again, feel free to submit anything else. But in closing, guys, we're right at about 2. Is there anything else you guys would like to add or say?
One thing I'd like to share as an archaeologist is that we are always looking for bright ideas and new technologies to map, recover, document, study, and understand the past. And, you know, for all those professionals that are out there, if you have an interest in applying some technology to the field, trying out something new. For right now, terrestrial LIDAR is something that we talk a lot about, but we have yet to really utilize. You know, tap your local archaeologists on the shoulder. We're all very interested in developing larger projects that look at broader questions about the past.
I just want to add that, like, I think like we have just started to scratch the surface. I mean, like in terms of Mesoamerica, we probably in like, when I say we, it's not only NCALM, but like if you put all the other projects, we probably have mapped like probably like about 5 to 10% of the area that it's there to map. So, you know, there's much more to come.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Paul, any other lasting or final comments? we got everything we can get from Paul. Perhaps you know, he might not still be connected, but hey, this was a wonderful session. I hope everyone agrees. Again, we'll follow up shortly. We appreciate your attendance, and I want to thank the presenters, especially you know, panelists. Thank you for doing this. We appreciate, and please, we'll follow up and be in touch shortly. Thank you all to everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good day.